In this video, we're going to learn about the history of Suez Canal, its geography, why is it important from global trade perspective, and in the end, we will learn how a giant container ship named Ever Given ended up getting stuck in the narrow stretches of Suez Canal, thereby blocking all maritime traffic. Let's begin with the video. So where is Suez Canal? It is an artificial canal that was built to connect Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. If you look at the word canal, it is basically a narrow body of water that connects two larger bodies of water. Here the two larger bodies are, one is the Mediterranean Sea and the other one is Red Sea. But one important point to remember is that if at all it is made by humans, then only you can call it a canal. Or else if it is naturally formed due to tectonic activity, then we call it a strait. For example, Strait of Gibraltar or Malacca Strait. They are also narrow body of water connecting larger bodies of water, but they were formed naturally. On the other hand, Suez Canal was officially built by the French in the mid-19th century. Now I will quickly tell you the history of Suez Canal. Suez Canal has been in work for over 150 years, ever since it was formally built. This canal existed even before its formal construction, in the form of a very narrow channel or a stream. So it is all said to have started from 1850 BCE. It is widely believed that the canal has existed in one form or the other since the reign of Senusret III, who was the pharaoh of Egypt from 1878 to 1839 BCE. Pharaoh is a title given to the rulers of ancient Egypt. Senusret III was one of the most powerful Egyptian ruler. One of his achievements was the building of the canal for diverting water to the irrigational areas of Eastern Nile region. As you know, River Nile is the longest river in the world, and it runs parallel to the Suez Canal. The region in between Suez Canal and River Nile is also known as the eastern side of Nile. The entire northern region of Egypt is in the form of a delta. The reason this place is called the Nile Delta is because the Nile River spreads out in this region, forming a delta before draining into the Mediterranean Sea. That means the land elevation of Egypt drops as you head to the northern region, towards the Mediterranean Sea. That is why the river Nile flows from south to north. Anyhow, King Senusret III is credited for building the Suez Canal to divert water from the Gulf of Suez to the far dry eastern region of Nile Delta. After him, many kings who ruled later kept improving and expanding this canal. Even when the Romans took control of Egypt in 30 BCE, and as we know, the Romans ruled for over 600 years until 648 AD, even the Romans have contributed in the extension of the Suez Canal. However, you have to understand this, that the ancient rulers dug this canal mainly to divert water from Gulf of Suez to the dry region of Eastern Nile Delta. And I have also told you that the land elevation in Egypt is low as we move from south to north. So digging a canal and channelizing water towards the northern region was very much in favor of the nature. But if you see the idea behind the formal construction and expansion of this canal solely for the purpose of maritime transport between Europe and Asia, that happened around 300 years back. In 1799, when the French had occupied Egypt, the French made the first survey to check whether a full-fledged canal can be made that would connect all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, Napoleon Bonaparte I, who was the Emperor of France, he personally looked into it whether or not a canal can be built. But then his efforts came to an end due to an inaccuracy in the measurements by the French engineers. You see, the level of the Red Sea was 10 meters above that of the Mediterranean Sea. South water from the Red Sea had to be blocked with the help of locks, otherwise it can cause flood. So due to the inaccuracy of the French engineers, the plans were dropped. Again, studies were done for the measurement of the canal in the mid-1800s. A French diplomat and engineer, Ferdinand de Lesseps, secured an agreement and convinced the Egyptian viceroy, who was also the Ottoman governor, for building a canal. In 1858, the Universal Suez Ship Canal Company was tasked to construct and operate the canal for 99 years, after which rights would be handed to the Egyptian government. Construction began in 1859 and took 10 years to complete. The reason it took 10 years was because of many challenges like climatic difficulties. Then there was a cholera epidemic in 1865. Then there was a problem with respect to labor. There were financial difficulties. And then the British and the Turks made many attempts to halt the construction. Finally, in August 1869, the waterway was completed and the canal was officially opened for international navigation. And by the way, the first digging of the canal in ancient Egypt was done by hands. Workers used picks and baskets for digging the land. Then later on, dredgers and steam shovels operated by European laborers took over. The French and the British held most of the shares in the canal company. Because, as you may know, after the French, the British took control of Egypt. The British occupied Egypt in 1882 through the Anglo-Egyptian War, and the French occupied Egypt from 1798 to 1801 after fighting the Battle of Abu Qir. If you remember, Tipu Sultan fought against the British and died in 1799. There were 4 Anglo-Mysore War. The 4th Anglo-Mysore War was from 1798 to 99. It saw the death of Tipu Sultan. It was in 1798 the French had also occupied Egypt. And the reason behind Napoleon Bonaparte's campaign in Egypt was, the first reason was to defend French trade interest against the Ottoman rulers in Egypt. And the second reason was to join the forces of Tipu Sultan and fight against the British. So basically, Napoleon Bonaparte's plan was to invade Egypt as the first step in a campaign against British India. So that is why when the construction of the Suez Canal was going on from 1859 to 69, the Turks and British constantly halted and interrupted the French engineers. So anyhow, after the French, the British occupied Egypt in 1882. The British succeeded in 1882 because till then, the French and the Ottoman Empire's authority almost became weak. French Empire after 1815 was defeated by the European powers, and that ended the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte. After the fall of Napoleon, again the monarchy of brothers of Louis XVI began. Napoleon Bonaparte became the Emperor of France after defeating King Louis XVI during the French Revolution. And now after the end of Napoleon rule, again King Louis XVI's family took over France. So anyhow, the British took over Egypt in 1882. As a result, even the Suez Canal came under the control of the British. The British had installed its defensive force along the Suez Canal as part of 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty. Under the terms of the treaty, the United Kingdom was required to withdraw all its troops from Egypt, except those necessary to protect the Suez Canal and its surroundings. The British knew about the importance of Suez Canal. It made the ships to sail directly from Mediterranean to Indian Ocean. Otherwise, they had to use the route that took them all around the Cape of Good Hope. By covering this entire long route, that would have taken many days and weeks. It is said that the voyage from England to India via the Cape of Good Hope took 6 months at least. So naturally, Suez Canal was very important for the British to reach India. And I must also add that after the 1857 revolt, the actual British Raj in India had started. Because before 1857, East India Company used to rule. So anyhow, the British maintained its forces along the Suez Canal till 1956. And by the way, British was in control of the Suez Canal during the World War I and II. As you all know, British was part of the Allied forces. Due to the naval and military superiority of the Allied forces, they actively controlled the Suez Canal so that Germany and its allies couldn't use the canal. Finally, in 1956, Egyptian President Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal to pay for the construction of a dam on the Nile. And that led to the Suez Crisis, with the UK, France and Israel attacking Egypt. The Suez Crisis is also referred to as the Second Arab-Israeli War. The first Arab-Israeli War happened in 1948. In 1956, when Israel, British, French attacked on Egypt, the Soviet Union wanted to support Egypt. If you remember, at that time, there was a geopolitical tension between the Soviet Union and the United States and their respective allies, the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, which we all refer to as Cold War. The definition of Cold War is fighting without confrontation. That means the basic idea behind Cold War was to wage war on political, economic and propaganda fronts and had only limited usage of weapons. That means the Suez Crisis of 1956 could have easily turned out to be a direct confrontation between the US and USSR. So to avoid such a confrontation, the American President Eisenhower pressured the British, French and Israeli governments to withdraw their troops. They eventually did so in late 1956 and early 1957. The conflict officially ended in 1957 when the United Nations got involved. Then in 1967, the Third Arab-Israeli War happened. This war was fought between Israel and the Arab countries, that is Jordan, Syria and Egypt. Now have a look at this map. You see this peninsula, it is called the Sinai Peninsula. Israeli forces occupied this in the 1967 war. In return, Egypt closed the Suez Canal. It was closed till 1975. As you know, Suez Canal is the lifeline for all trade between the West and the East. It was closed for almost 8 years from 1967 to 1975. In 1975, both the countries, that is Egypt and Israel, signed a disengagement accord. Basically, there was a ceasefire line created on land, sea and air. It is also said that because of the 1956 Suez Crisis, then Arab-Israeli War of 1960s, the United States had a plan in the 1960s to blast an alternative Suez Canal through Israel using nuclear bombs. This new Israeli canal plan was thought to be excavated through Israel's Negev desert. If you look at the Red Sea, one branch of the Red Sea water forms the Gulf of Suez and the other forms the Gulf of Aqaba, and this is the Israeli border. So the plan was to build an alternative canal very close to the Israeli border. So anyhow, that was the American plan because of the crisis during the 50s and 60s, because they realized that Suez Canal route is very important for maritime transport. However, countries like Egypt controlling the jurisdiction of such an important geostrategic route is also a concern for powerful first world countries like US, UK, Europe, Russia, Turkey and Israel. But anyhow, the canal was reopened in June 1975. A peace treaty was signed between Egypt and Israel in 1979. After which the Sinai Peninsula was returned to Egypt and demilitarized under the terms of the agreement. However, this peninsula still remains the site of number of militant attacks. Anyhow, after 1979, all ships including those of Israeli registration again had access to the waterway. As we all know, the Suez Canal is the lifeline for all trade between the West and the East. It is estimated that 12% of the global trade passes through this route every year. At an average, somewhere around 50 ships pass through this canal daily, carrying about $9.5 billion worth of goods every day. Now that you are aware of the history, that leaves us to the last question. What happened on 23rd March 2021? As you may remember, there was a giant container ship named Ever Given, ended up getting stuck in the narrow stretches of Suez Canal, thereby blocking all traffic. There's a confusion with respect to the name of the ship, whether it is Evergreen or Ever Given. So let me clear that first. The official name of the ship is Ever Given, and the ship is operated by a Taiwanese company called Evergreen Marine. The owner of the ship is a Japanese company called Shue Kaisen Kaisha. Many of the ships operated by Evergreen have names that start with the name Ever, such as Evergoods, Everglory and Evergentle. The ship was sailing from a port in Malaysia to Rotterdam in the Netherlands. It is a cargo ship. The Ever Given is one of the world's largest container ship. It is larger than the Eiffel Tower. It is big enough to carry 20,124 TEUs. TEUs means 20-foot equivalent unit. In simple words, there are two common international standardized container types. One is 20 and other one is 40 feet long. So if it says the Ever Given ship was big enough to carry 20,124 TEU, it means 20,124 containers can be placed on the ship. The ship has that much of capacity. Similarly, if you place 40 feet long containers, then the same capacity will reduce to half. So if you look at this list of container ships, the Ever Given ship falls under the category of ultra large container ships. This massive container ship got jammed in the Suez Canal in such a way that the front side of the ship has wedged into the eastern wall of the canal, blocking over 200 ships on both sides of the canal. If you look at the canal, this is the Gulf of Suez. A gulf is a large inlet of water from the ocean or sea into the landmass. Basically, the shape of the landmass is such that some part of the sea or ocean water forms an inlet. So here some part of the Red Sea water forms the Gulf of Suez. After entering the Suez Canal, ships have to halt in this Gulf area. Only after getting a signal, they can proceed to the Suez Canal, passing through Port Tawfiq. As you proceed towards the Suez Canal, the entrance of the canal is narrow. The Suez Canal is around 160 km long, 25 meters deep and 200 to 300 meters wide at the surface. After crossing the Suez Canal, ships have to halt again in the Great Bitter Lake. From Great Bitter Lake, when you proceed further towards the northern region of the canal, you will find two lanes for simultaneous two-way traffic. This second lane was commissioned in 2015. That means the northern region of the Suez Canal was expanded in 2015, but not the southern region. This two-way lane continues for about 35 to 40 kilometers. After that, it merges into one lane. Further in about 50 kilometers, the ships exit into the Mediterranean Sea, passing through the Port Said. The Ever Given ship was jammed in the southern region of the Suez Canal at 5:40 am UTC. It remained stuck for nearly a week. The vessel is 1,312 feet long. It is exactly the maximum length permitted in the canal. If you look at the picture of the traffic jam on that day, have a look at this picture. All these yellow dots that you see, these are ships waiting. This is the Great Bitter Lake area. As I said, after that 2 lane starts, and this is the Gulf of Suez. As I said, ships have to halt here. Once they get a signal, only then they can proceed towards the canal. And the red dot is the Ever Given ship, which got jammed. And now answering the last question. How did this ship get stuck? When the ship entered the Suez Canal in the early morning of 23rd March, the ship got hit by a strong sandstorm. The winds were blowing at 74 km per hour, heavily battering the ship and decreasing the level of visibility. As I've mentioned, it was a fully loaded ultra-large container ship. Just imagine a container ship carrying thousands of containers stacked on top of each other in order to utilize the space efficiently. These days you can see 10 to 12 containers stacked on top of each other. Each container is about 8.5 feet high. That means after stacking containers on top of each other, the height will be roughly around 100 feet. These huge container stacks are exposed to great forces when container ships move in heavy weather. The bad weather caused this giant container ship to lodge sideways and block the southern region of the Suez Canal, and completely closing up one of the main arteries of global trade.